for the meantime, we have a couple of questions from Patreon. Once a month, we do this show called the Opening Lab, where I take questions from some of our subscribers, and I just do a little bit of research depending on what the question is, maybe some analysis, and then I present my thoughts on the show. You guys that are watching in the chat are welcome to ask kind of like follow-up questions, or if anything I talk about doesn't really make sense, please feel free to ask a question. But I won't be able to answer everyone's questions. If you have like a question on an opening that's like we're not even talking about, then I'll probably skip over that one, because this is kind of something that we try to provide for our Patreon subscribers once a month. Is kind of like this nice thing where they can send in opening questions, and then I do my best to cover them. So first question is from Jimmy. I think this is his first time submitting a question. Jimmy, let me know if you're in the chat, because I might have some follow-up questions for you. All right, so Jimmy asks, let me hit you with some numbers. Out of 197 Trompowsky games, including Blitz, 74 were 2e6 and 47 were 3 bishop e7. So the position he's talking about, let me put it on the board, is d4, knight f6, bishop g5, e6, 2e6. White here plays e4 now that we have this pin. And here he says a lot of games go bishop e7. Main line I would say is h6 here, because it puts pressure on white's bishop, and now if the bishop goes back, then black will go g5 and then take the e4 pawn. So this isn't really, I think, good for white. So what white normally does here is they take on f6, they give up the bishop pair, but in return they bring black's queen out kind of in front of their own bishop, and this is a little bit awkward for black's development. And white here already has like this nice center. So you give up the bishop for a couple of other advantages. And I would say this is considered pretty like balanced, but also like double-edged at the same time, because we have quite a few imbalances in the position. But Jimmy's asking about bishop e7. Let's go back to the question. All right, meaning that at my level, this position is far and away the most popular to play. Now, Jimmy, I'm not sure where exactly you're getting these numbers from. I mean, this is a position that's been reached like, thousands and thousands of times in like the databases. So I feel like we should have more than 197 Trompowsky games. So I'm not really clear on where you got this number, but I am with you in that this is a very popular way that people play. So 100% worth looking at. Okay, he says, I know better than to try to refute these kinds of openings. Yeah, absolutely. But was hoping you could take a look at my notes and help answer some of my questions / correct my thinking. Yeah, absolutely. And then we get into the line with d4, we get the Trompowsky, and let's put some more of these moves on the board. So e5, knight d5, very natural. White can also play like knight d2 in this position. And then if black wants to play d5 and e5, we get a type of French, which is a very normal French, except white didn't put the knight on c3. This knight is actually on d2, which I think superficially would be a good version for white, because that means we can play c3 and strengthen the d4 pawn, which normally you can't do with the knight on c3. So I looked at this a little bit. I don't know, I think queen g4 is kind of an interesting move here. This is a typical idea in these positions because it like hits the g7 pawn, and then it forces black to make some kind of concession. Like g6 is of course weakening, and then that gives white some dark squares and like a hook to attack like h4, h5. But also if black just castles, it doesn't look like black made any weakness, but he did commit his king. And now white has like a clear target. So you go like bishop d3 in these kinds of positions, knight f3. You can play for the Greek gift sacrifice. At a certain point, black is going to have to play like f5 or something to kind of shut down this idea, because white will be threatening to take on h7 very, very soon. So this is kind of possible as well. But e5 I think is probably the critical move, because here white just immediately forces a trade of dark squared bishops. And again, this is kind of like a superficial thing, but like, yeah, with this structure where white gets d4, e5, kind of like a French-like structure, the dark squared bishop is the bishop that we're definitely more willing to part with, and we usually do want to trade it off for black's dark squared bishop, because in the long run, it's gonna, well, we have better control over their dark squares, right? Because our pawns are on dark squares. Dark square bishops are missing. No one has a dark square bishop, but we have a couple of extra pawns covering these dark squares, and of course, that gives our light squared bishop a little bit more scope. So already here, like, I feel like white is already feeling well, or feeling pretty good about how things are going, just because we have this potential like long-term strategic advantage with having the better bishop. And this e5 pawn I think is generally pretty good if it can be supported, which it feels like it can be. Like we can play f4 here, we can play knight f3, and I don't think we're gonna have like huge issues defending our center here. So I looked at this a little bit, and I feel like a lot of the positions they definitely resemble the French, and I'm always kind of like comparing it because I used to play the French, and so I'm just wondering, like, you know, is this like a good version or not? And like, it's not really a great version of the French for black. A lot of these positions they just don't seem like that much fun to play. And I know Jimmy is a correspondence player, and so we have to make a distinction here. Like when you play a position like this in correspondence, I should be clear. It's like, I'm not a correspondence player, so these guys are often like analyzing the position with their engines, and they're going super deep. And like, I'm not really sure what would be the best way to approach this, because I'm sure the engine is probably going to be able to hold it as black. But over the board, of course, it's a completely different story, because we're like posing practical problems for the opponent, and our opponent is now going to be an engine that can just defend perfectly against some threats. So if we start creating some threats, posing some issues, a lot of players are not going to be able to handle that. So to me, this feels like a very like practically pleasant position for white to play, because we have all these like little like strategic advantages, and it seems like there's a lot of stuff going on in white's favor. But let's go through some of the lines here. Yeah, I think for official correspondence, it's basically like, it's mostly just people like, you know, analyzing with their engines and trying to come up with some deep ideas. Yeah, black can also take on e7 with the queen. And then I think the line that Jimmy gives is like c4, knight b6, bishop d3. Actually, the first question comes here after bishop d3, d6. Takes, knight f3, castles, knight c6. And the question is, what is white's way to move forward here? The computer gives a solid edge for white, but I'm not sure how to handle this type of position. So yeah, I found one game, and I looked at this a little bit. This is what I would do with white. I would just play rook e1 in this position, because of course the rook I think belongs on the file. And there's this game where black played e5. Playing black is Bortnik, by the way, so pretty strong player. And the way I kind of analyze this with the computer is like, I don't know, I usually just try to insert my own moves first, and then I just see like what the engine thinks. So the first move I came up with was just like knight c3, and then the engine suggested bishop g4, and then the evaluation dropped, and I was like, yeah, that's annoying, bishop g4, now I have to deal with this pin. So I'm like, okay, Stockfish, you're right. So I go back a move, and I'm like, you know what, knight bd2. Let's play this. Now after bishop g4, white goes like h3, bishop h5, queen c2. And, well, basically what I feel like is going on in this middle game, it just feels like white has pressure against the queen on the e-file. We have a little bit a better structure here, because like, well, basically black's d-pawn is always going to be like a long-term weakness here. Like at no point do we have to take on e5 here as white, but at some point these pawns might get traded, and then black's d6 pawn might be weak. So yeah, I don't know. You can analyze this one further. Like with queen c2, we're hitting h7, so black has to defend here. We'll play like a3 next move to cover knight b4. The rook comes to d1. Basically, we have this like central tension that I think is not going to be easy for black to resolve here. So like from a practical point of view, this feels like just a very, very nice position for white. Okay, so let's go back. So I think knight takes e7 is kind of the main line here. And yeah, like my first instinct here would be to just play like a French. Like if I just had this position in a bullet game, my first instinct move would be bishop to d3. And the reason for that is like, okay, this bishop is well known to be good on this square, like in pretty much all French positions. We kind of want it on this diagonal. And we might want to play knight f3 here, but we might want to play f4 as well. And so it's not clear which one of these moves we really want to make. If you really want to play f4, it would make sense to play it here. Actually, this was one of Jimmy's suggestions. I would say this is a completely reasonable way to play. Like I think the line he gave was d6, knight c3, knight c6. Or maybe this was my line, knight f3. I found one idea here. If black takes on e5, a lot of players would take fe, but actually d takes e5 would be the way to go here, and then trying to get some play on the d file, like rook takes d1, like knight b5 is a threat, maybe a6, bishop d3, and then we put a piece on e4. Basically, white has a lot of space in this position, and of course, it's like really difficult for black to do something with the light squared bishop. So that's kind of black's problem in all of these positions, and it's really not that easy for them to figure it out. In the meantime, white has like this kind of nice space in the center. So this I think actually is totally reasonable. Like I really like white's position. If black doesn't take on e5, you can play just like bishop d3 here, castles, and look for kingside play. In general, that would be the plan. As soon as black castles kingside, you start looking for the Greek gift sacrifice. You start looking for f5 ideas. Basically, that would be the way to do it. I found a couple of interesting lines here. I was just analyzing. Again, I think bishop d3 might be the most natural choice for me. And then I figure, okay, most flexible move for black would probably be d6. Although there's been a couple of interesting games here. For instance, I found one game where I think it was Pragnananda, the Indian prodigy. He had this as white. His opponent played c5. Actually, I want to show you guys this game just because it was a beautiful game. Like, I don't think it's going to be super instructive for the opening, but it was a really nice game, actually. So c5, he takes on c5, which is already instructive because so many players here would just play c3, kind of just like according to stereotype, I would say. Like black goes c5, you play c3, and that's it. Like just defend the pawn. But he takes on c5, realizing that he is going to be able to plant his knight on the d6 square while black is trying to win back this pawn. So queen a5 check, knight d2, takes knight f3, just covering this one, knight g6, knight e4, queen a5 check, and now b4, very strong actually, because he gets this tempo on the queen, black takes with check, he gets another tempo, and then this tempo allows him to get knight d6 with check, and so black never has time to castle the king. Then he takes on g6, just like gets rid of this knight, castles, and now like black just has this like horrible bishop, knight on d6 is amazing, and yeah, like black's pieces have a hard time getting out. So yeah, this was played back in like 2016, so this was like this is like a couple years, this is like 5 years ago, so imagine how strong he must be now. By the way, knight takes e5, he finds this, knight c4, knight takes e5, d6, and now white to play, guys. What do you think? Queen d6, yeah, Matt and Trooper with the tactics, yep. Like a study. Queen d6, knight c4 takes, and yeah, now he was just up a piece, knight takes b7, another tactic. And then, okay. Even this one actually might not be the easiest thing to win. But he manages. Whoops. Sorry, skip to the end. That was actually really nice. He like sacks the knight for the pawn. Because if black takes, then his king is too far away, and he's just going to come up and take these pawns. So black tries to keep it tricky, and yeah, that was game over. Yeah, really nice game. Hey, Anonymous with the gifted sub. Thanks very much. So yeah, that was just one game. I think on bishop d3, I don't know, the move that I would be tempted to play as black is just like d6, just challenging the center. And then I found this move here, queen g4, that seems pretty annoying. And again, I think the engine will defend here, but for a human, it's not going to be so easy. Number one, if knight g6, then we just hit him with h4. And then the threat is h5, and the g7 pawn is hanging. If black goes h5, then the knight on g6 is going to be under attack, so we'll just back up queen g3. And now this is going to be a problem, and black has given up the g5 square, which is probably pretty serious. And if black castles here, then we play knight f3. And this line, I think, very dangerous in blitz, because you're like already threatening to take on h7 in this position. It's just bishop takes h7, queen h5 check. You don't even give the king a chance to come out. Like after knight g5, king goes back to g8 and then knight g5, and that's just like devastating. So already here, this is like very dangerous. I think black has to play like f5, only move. And yeah, I was thinking like queen g3, take on e5, pawn takes e5. Then you play like knight c3 here, you castle queenside. It looks really unpleasant for black. Again, I think the engine, you know, finds a way to get something playable, but like in blitz over the board, I would feel like white is doing really, really well. Like you get the rook on the d file very, very quickly. I mean, think about how many moves it's going to take for black to connect rooks here. Like that's kind of an advantage in and of itself. And I think this is kind of the trick to analyzing with engines. It's like if you're not really sure what to do, you have to kind of put your own evaluations into the position. And here it's like this is an evaluation I can understand. Like if white's rooks are connected and black's rooks are not connected, then like that's usually going to be really, really good tactically. Like our rooks are in the game, they're coordinated, and the opponents are not. And then of course we have all the previous advantages, like having the nice light square bishop, the space advantage. This is nice. We have ideas of like maybe bringing the knight to f4, using the h-pawn to create some weaknesses, maybe putting the bishop on c4 after we castle queenside, again using the d file. And this e6 pawn is kind of an annoying weakness for black, right? Because the best square for this bishop would now be on b7, and if the bishop could get to b7, then it would be a really good piece. But if the bishop goes to b7, then of course it's leaving this pawn behind, and that makes it a lot easier for white to put pressure on it. So it's really not, it doesn't feel like a really comfortable position to hold for black. That would be kind of my like human instinct to how to go into this position. And there are other ways to play as well. You can play with like f4 and stuff. Like we mentioned earlier, I think this one is pretty interesting too. But my choice would probably be bishop d3, and then going for one of these early like queen g4, knight f3 plans. I think these are pretty dangerous for black. Okay, Jimmy, hope that answers your question. Let me scroll down here. So basically it just goes into everything we just discussed. All right, let's go to the next question from Always Double Check. Whoops. All right, and they're asking, how should King's Indian players deal with the move order d4, knight f6, bishop f4, g6, knight c3? Let's put it on the board. Hey, ADC in the chat, nice. All right, so d4, knight f6, let's flip the board, bishop f4, g6, and now knight c3. Right, or white can start with knight c3 in this position, and then see what you're going to do about e4. If you play d5, then they'll play bishop f4 here, and then we kind of have to play this thing. Yeah, so this is known as the Jobava London, and let me just say, I never really understood this name, to be honest with you guys, because the London system is not just about putting the bishop on f4. Like, that's not the point of the London system. The London system is like this whole setup, right, with knight f3, e3, c3, and so on. I would say this opening is closer in spirit to the Veresov attack, right? So let's talk about the Jobava line. The Jobava line goes like this: bishop f4, and from here white has different attacking setups. There's like queen d2 stuff if black goes g6, but the way Jobava would play it is he would play with like f3 and e3. sometimes even playing for e4. And you really like this kind of setup. Sometimes white castles queenside here, like queen d2, the bishop goes to d3, knight gets developed somewhere. It's kind of like an interesting attacking idea. The Veresov with bishop g5 is basically very, very similar. One of the ideas is to play queen d2. The other idea is to play for like f3, e4, castle queenside, playing like g4 ideas. It's like they're very, very similar. So this opening, in my opinion, my humble opinion, should be called the Jobava-Veresov. If you're going to call it something like that, I don't know. I mean, you can just call it the Jobava attack. I would be fine with that too. If you're going to call it something, you know, Jobava-Veresov, to me makes sense. Because he would, I think, I'm pretty sure he would start with knight c3. He wouldn't start with a London move order and then play knight c3. Not that that's super important, but I'm pretty sure he would start with this one and then put the bishop on f4. He also would put the bishop on b2 in a bunch of games, but I don't think that didn't quite catch on. Anyway, so let's talk about how to actually deal with the line. I did have, I'm pretty sure I answered this in previous opening lab, so if you want to like a PGN of some of my notes, always double check. You can go back to past shows. I don't remember which one it was. But I remember covering this line at some point. But I'm happy to give my thoughts again. And yeah, the problem for black is that when white plays knight c3, they're threatening to play e4, and then we don't really get a king's Indian here. What we get is a perk, right? And the difference between a king's Indian and this is that white hasn't committed to c4, which means that when white castles queenside in these positions, their king is going to be a lot safer, excuse me. Whereas in a king's Indian, the pawn is on c4 already, so whenever white castles queenside, that comes with some inherent risk because the pawn is a little bit extended. So some king's Indian players are totally fine with playing this position, and absolutely it is playable. I myself have played this line with knight c6 quite a bit, and I would be fine here. But it might not be what you want to play against e4, right? So for a king's Indian player, it doesn't really make sense to allow this if it's not really your cup of tea. But I do think all of these d5 lines are fully playable for black. And then you can find a lot of systems where any way you go g6, bishop, g7 castles, you play for c5. It's not like a king's Indian, but you know, you still get your fianchettoed bishop. And okay, you can't just play like king's Indian every single game, right? Like try some different structures every once in a while. Bishop is still on g7. You still get your c5 break. You still want to bring your knight to c6. All the principles of chess still apply. It's just going to be, you know, a different type of position. So yeah, I think king's Indian players should just go into this one, and let's go a little bit deeper here. So this can be like bishop f4, g6, knight c3, and then I think we should just play d5 here. Or they can start with knight c3, we play d5, and then they have bishop g5 as an option, the classic Veresov, which you would also have to know, or bishop f4, which just transposes to the line that we want after g6. So yeah, let's talk about how to play this position. I do want to note, against bishop f4, I once played d6 because what I did was d4, I played d6 here. White played bishop f4, I played g6, and then he played knight c3, bishop g7, e4, and here actually knight c6 was kind of an interesting way to develop for black. So if you know your opponent is going to be doing this kind of stuff, you can mess around with the move order. But obviously if you play d6 on move 1, be warned that your opponent can totally play e4 and get you into a perk anyway. So if you're not okay with this, it might not be the move order for you. But I knew that white was going to play bishop f4. I was actually expecting a London system. He surprised me with knight to c3. And then we got this, and then on d5 in this position, I actually missed. I could play this move e5. So this is kind of a nice trick against this bishop on f4. If you guys are familiar with like e4, e5 lines, there's a lot of lines like Scotch Gambit and like Joko Piano, where at some point black goes like e takes d4, white pushes e5 attacking our knight on f6, and then black has a very important move d5, like counterattacking the bishop on c4. And we get the counterattack, and then we get like the e4 square for black. I know it might be kind of weird to visualize. So here it's kind of like the same thing. It's like white is attacking the knight. We're going e5 to attack the bishop, and like stake some space in the center. And I think black is like absolutely fine. If like take, we just get this like powerful long dark square bishop, and we're doing great. And if the bishop goes back, actually I would just play like knight e7 here, now that we have the square for the knight. And well, basically you get what you want. You get a King's Indian, and a pretty good King's Indian actually, because white's c-pawn is now blocked, and so white has no plan on the queen side. So this position I think is very, very sketchy for white. So this is kind of like, I don't know, cool trick line, I guess you could try to get. But if we're gonna just talk about the repertoire itself, let's go to this position. So bishop f4, g6, knight c3, d5, and now white has a couple of different ways of playing this one. So a lot of players here, they go queen d2, bishop g7, and bishop h6, and they just go for the direct attack. And honestly, this is pretty annoying if you don't know how to deal with this, because you don't really want to take, then queen takes h6, and you can't, it's hard to castle. And if you castle, which I think is the right move, then you do have to know what to do, like when white just goes h4, h5, and tries to checkmate you. And I think a lot of players struggle against this kind of attack, because it's just like, it's kind of barbaric, but it's like very straightforward, and it makes a lot of sense, just like h4, h5, just playing on the h file and then trying to checkmate on h7. So it's kind of very direct and easy for white to play this. That said, I think this position is completely fine for black, as long as you play this move c5 here and just immediately get counterplay. So this is one you might want to, like, analyze for a bit on your own, I think, just to get an idea of what's happening here. But basically we have to create enough counterplay on d4 before white's attack with h5 is going to land. Now the main move for white in this position is to just take on g7, king takes g7, and then go e3, essentially just kind of shutting down and developing. And then I think like black can just take, you go h5 here, very important to stop white from pushing h5, and then you're just totally fine. You go like knight c6, bishop f5, and black is completely okay here. Whoops, sorry, let's go back. Right, so that's the move that the pros play, they go e3. But of course, like, if you play c5, you have to understand, like, well, what happens after h5, right? So a lot of players are just going to play h5 here, and they're just going to try to checkmate you. Now, it doesn't really work, but of course, we should be aware that these types of lines are possible. So now the point of c5 is that we're just trying to create counterplay and argue that white's queen is overloaded, defending everything. That's why it turns out that the best move for white is to just first take on g7. Of course, white doesn't want to take on g7, because when we take back, we're able to play h5 and stop their plan. White would like to keep the bishop on h6 until they play h5 so that they can take on g6 and get the queen to h6. So on c5, if white just keeps pushing h5, then black takes on d4. And basically, you got to trust that you're getting enough counterplay here. You're hitting the knight. White can take. This is okay. We'll take back. And they can take here. And you'll have to analyze this one. I'm pretty sure we can just get away with taking the knight. I don't think white has like a mating attack. Probably you can play fg here, and I think you're okay because you took this pawn. You have knight c6 coming. Again, I would encourage you to analyze this one on your own just so you get a sense. This is very scary when you play it, like in Blitz and Rapid if you don't have experience here. So the value of like analyzing this position and like training games really cannot be understated, because you got to feel like comfortable with these positions before you're going into them. But long story short, black is okay in these lines. After c5, you are getting enough counterplay. And if white takes on c5, then the idea is usually to push d4, and you get counterplay in the center with knight to c6, and so on. If you're not willing to fight for the counterplay, though, then you're going to have a real problem. If you're playing moves like c6, bishop f5, knight d7, just like calm developing moves and not really doing anything, you very well could get checkmated in this position. That's why it's so important for black to just always be striking back in the center. Very, very important. Okay. So that's one way white can play with like queen d2, bishop h6 that I think is pretty common. But yeah, if you just remember castle h4, c5, then basically you're good. And I mean, actually, if I remember correctly, like objectively, h5 here is very dubious for white. It's not like it's like unclear and you're okay if you find the right moves. No, like if you find the right moves, you get a big advantage here as black, because white's position just collapses. Like there's no reason that white should be winning in this position, right? Like what have you done wrong? You've developed your pieces and put some pawns in the center. So this is like a very, very risky thing for white to do. Dory, do you play this line in white as white? That's funny. Yeah, but many players, of course, whoops, they panic because they just don't know what to do. And yeah, when we get hit with this h4, h5 stuff, you know, one slow move can absolutely make or break your position. So very, very important to strike back. Okay. Oh man, I keep hitting down. It's because I'm not used to the keyboard. Sorry, guys. The other way white can play, which I think becomes more popular at higher levels, is to play with e3 here, bishop g7, and then h4. And there's quite a few players that like this for white, so I'm sure it's going to be popular for some time. And then the idea is just to go h5 and like sack the exchange. Now, this exchange sack is not necessarily great. Like this line c6 I think is totally playable for black. Just playing c6 here, and then if they play h5, you take the exchange. And if you're not afraid of this one, I would say just play into this one. Just take the material. Don't castle into the attack. First bring your knight to like f6, maybe play h5 to stake out some ground. And white's not really going to get enough for the exchange. This is more of like a blitz weapon where it's like not comfortable to play the position for black. But if you're kind of a materialist and you're happy to have the exchange and you're looking at the position, you don't really buy what white has here, then absolutely go for this one. You know, take the rook and punish them. I mean, the engine will show that black has a big advantage here. So it's not like white has a good attack. It's more that it's just not everyone's favorite position to play. Personally, I don't like these kinds of positions. I would rather be the one sacrificing material. So I would just play h5 here, and I've done this a couple of times. And then you just shut down their attack. And it's just like, yep, sorry. And now, of course, there's theory here that continues, but the basic plan is to castle. Once again, push c5. We have this bishop on g7. It needs to be helped and supported by pawns. So you push c5, support the bishop. Knight wants to come out to c6. This bishop wants to come out to f5. The rook wants to come out to c8. The queen wants to come to like b6 or a5, kind of depending, and get some counterplay. And basically, well, we're fighting for counterplay in the center. Like your bishop is pointed on this diagonal and towards the queen side, and we have this kind of central play, mainly connected with like c5, knight c6. How about h6 intending to meet h5 with g5? Let's think about that one. So h6, let's say h5, we play g5. We create some weaknesses in our position, and I don't think we quite close things up, especially like this f5 square might be a problem one day. White is probably like just going to put the bishop on d3. Even if we play bishop f5 ourselves, white will play bishop d3 is my guess. And then we're going to have these light squares to deal with. Maybe the knight one day tries to find g3 as well. Not that this is bad necessarily. It could very well be playable. I've just always liked h5 myself. So now how a lot of the games go from here is like knight f3, for example, will castle. And sure, white can put the knight on g5, but it's not like a ton of follow-up from here. In fact, white's main plan in these positions is usually to put the knight on e5 and try to get this g4 break in, which is very logical. And they'll go like bishop e2 and g4, and they're trying to open lines on the king side. So this is a really like sharp position. I've had like a couple of games in this one. They have definitely not all been successful. In fact, I remember losing some really painful games that I was doing really well out of the opening, but because these positions are so sharp, doing well in the opening doesn't guarantee, you know, that you win the game. So there's still lots and lots of room for error. But the main plan again is to play c5, play for this counterplay, and bring the knight to c6. So let's say, for example, white goes bishop e2, we'll play knight to c6 here. And I mean, if white tries g4 like super early, our idea is that we should be able to handle it. Knight takes e5, and then however white takes back, we're going to take on g4, and everything stays solid. If you got to take on g4 with the pawn at some point, then white plays h5, this gets very, very risky very fast, right? We usually don't want this. I wouldn't want this. If this kind of thing happens and you're like not totally in control, it's very easy to just blunder and get checkmated. But if you can take on g4 with a piece, then you're not opening up that many lines for the opponent. And so this is pretty solid. I would say black is completely fine here. Dor has a good point. You know, play it with white. Actually, yeah, guys, like I think one thing that kind of doesn't really get stated enough is like if there's a line that's like really causing you trouble and you're like always getting checkmated by this one line, play it. You know, you'll see why it's not so easy. You'll always see that the other side has its own issues. It's not always easy to attack. There's many different ways to defend. And as the attacker, actually, you do have to take on a lot of risk yourself, because when you play this like super sharp stuff as white, a lot of times it means you're not castling, or you're castling late, or you're castling queenside, and there's going to be counterplay there. And so you take on a lot of risk yourself. So, you know, nothing on the chessboard is free. There are no lines that are just like free attacks, zero drawbacks. You know, you just either you get a checkmate or it's like an equal position, except the tromp wall. The tromp wall is like a perfect system, no drawbacks. I have a video on it on our YouTube channel. Tromp wall is like, yeah, perfect opening, basically. No flaws or leaks whatsoever. Okay. So white cannot just like get g4 in this early. Again, white should not have like a winning attack if black hasn't done anything wrong yet. It's just not logical. Chess is a balanced game. So I would encourage you guys to, you know, believe in your position. You know, you shouldn't just be getting mated if you haven't done anything wrong. So they can't go g4 this early. What a lot of players do is they'll play like queen d2 and they'll castle queenside. And this is like a really fun middle game to analyze. What I would do is I would probably take on d4 to open the c file, and play like either bishop e6 or bishop f5 here, followed by bringing the rook to c8. Whoops, the queen coming to b6. And yeah, we're just going to try to put pressure on the queen side here, especially if white soon ends up castling, which they usually do. Then yeah, we get a lot of counterplay with our pieces. Thanks, JB. Oh, Trump wall. Oh, I didn't even think of that. Huh. That is funny. Okay. Let's see. Yeah, I'm sure there's different ways of playing this position for white that I haven't mentioned yet, but in general, my plan is like bishop g7, castle, basically everywhere. We're not really worried about castling, although some players will delay it, and then try to play c5 with the bishop on g7. You're trying to use the bishop on the diagonal and put pressure on it. One game actually that I remember learning from was this game between Neidich and Carlsen. Neidich, the German grandmaster, who then switched to Azerbaijan, and then I think tried to switch back to Germany. And then against Magnus, I think this was a couple of years ago. So how did that game go? That was like e3, bishop g7, h4, h5, knight f3, castles, bishop e2, Magnus goes c5, and white takes. And you can look up this game just to see exactly what happened, but basically black was completely fine here after queen a5. I think white castled, queen takes c5, knight d2, and I believe Magnus played here. I'm not sure I quite remember. Maybe it was like queen a5 or a6 or something, but long story short, black was okay. You know, the knight can come out to c6. As long as you don't get your like queen trapped here in a second, you'll basically be fine. You can look up that game to see how Magnus played it and basically see he solved all his problems with black. No, it's the Tromp wall, guys, because it's the Trompowsky Stonewall hybrid. Trompowsky. Tromp wall. Trompowsky Stonewall. Hey, Legends of Cornwall, good to see you. I think I remember that game. I feel your username is very familiar to me. That was a fun game, I'm sure. Much appreciated. Thanks for stopping by. Is the Trompol just for Rapid and Blitz, or will it work in Classical too? I've seen it work in Classical. I mean, against me, it was played in a G60 game, and I had a really hard time. So, you know, again, not to like, not to toot my own horn, but like, I had a really hard time against it. And if you look at the database, lots of players around my level and higher, even higher, like Magnus played like a similar system against like 2600 GM or GMs and can do very well. So yeah, I think it's playable in all time controls, for real. Okay, always double check. Hopefully that helps. Let's go on to our final question for this month. And this one comes from Ian, longtime supporter. Thank you, Ian, who asks, how should white meet the Semi-Slav when starting with d4? Okay, well, this is a big question, but let's get into it, because Semi-Slav is a serious opening. Does anyone play the Semi-Slav or Slav in general in the chat? Or if you're a d4 player, I imagine you have to deal with the Semi-Slav. So there's a couple options. Let's first get to it. Usually it comes from a Slav move order, and before you get to the Semi-Slav, you first have to deal with the Slav. So the way the main position usually comes, I think, is through this route. White plays knight c3, and black goes e6, and then we have our Semi-Slav, and we have a bunch of options. But the move order can be important. The other way you can get to it is through a Queen's Gambit declined move order, where here white can often play either like knight c3 or knight f3. Let's say knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, c6. And the funkiest move order, I think, to get to the Semi-Slav is through a Nimzo. You can get d4, knight f6, c4, e6. And then here's like, and this has happened to me many times. I'm like, well, I don't want to play Nimzo. I'll play knight f3 here. Black goes d5. We go knight c3. And now c6. And we're back into our Semi-Slav. So if you're a Semi-Slav player, you have some options in terms of the move order based on what you want to allow. So some players, they like the Semi-Slav, but they don't want to allow an exchange Slav after d5, c4, c6. They don't want to play the exchange positions, right? So they prefer to go through a Queen's Gambit declined move order or a Nimzo move order. Whoops, keep playing e5. So this or Nimzo move order, and then they avoid the exchange Slav. But of course, if you play Nimzo move order, then you also have to be ready to play Nimzo. And so not everyone wants to do this either. So there's always drawbacks in terms of the move order. But for white, there are some issues as well. So let's take the regular Slav move order. If you play knight c3 in this position, then after d takes c4, these lines are, there's a lot of theory here. You have to know this line, you also have to know a6, and of course you need something against the Semi-Slav. Some players against the Slav will play like e3 or queen c2. And what I like about these lines is that for white, you don't have to deal with as many options. Now after e3, there's like a million options here for black. But from white's point of view, your play is often the same. You're going to put the bishop on d3, this bishop goes to b2, and then you can decide. You have different setups with knight c3, knight d2, and so on. You can play for like e4 in these positions. You can play with knight d2 and then bringing this knight to e5 and bringing the other knight over to f3, kind of going for like a Pillsbury attack, Stonewall kind of thing. There's different ways to play that, and it's very, very flexible. With knight c3 here, this is maybe the most ambitious approach, but it also leads to maybe the most number of lines, especially after d takes c4. The knight on c3 is not good at winning back this pawn. It just doesn't have an easy time, and it actually makes things harder for us because if, let's say, we played any other move, we would have an easier time taking back on c4. Let's say we just play like h3 here. Black takes on c4, we go e3, b5, a4, and here you can kind of see the difference with this knight on c3. Black would have like b4 there, and it already gets a little bit annoying. With no knight on c3, there's no b4, we just get the free pressure. We're going to play b3 here. Of course, h3 wasn't even the most useful move by far, but this is kind of the idea. So this knight on c3, it actually can get in the way. And a lot of times it does feel more flexible either on d2 or even back on b1. All right, but let's talk about the Semi-Slav. So Semi-Slav is this exact position, right? This is the starting point of the Semi-Slav. Now I would say we have like two main options for white. We got bishop g5 and we got e3. And then there are some side options that are also playable. There's like g3, there's queen b3, queen d3, and then there's like little sidelines along the way. Okay, so I guess I'll just lay out the options, and then Ian, you can decide which one you like more. Of course, against the Slav itself, there are other options too, like playing the exchange Slav, playing the e3 lines, playing one of those other lines also. Bishop g5, this has always been considered like, let's say, the most ambitious approach. This is like the bishop g5 Najdorf of the Semi-Slav. There's a ton of theory here, but in my opinion, like, if you want to play for the initiative, I think at most levels, white has more fun in these lines. Like at the highest levels, you know, black knows all the theory, they're fine. You know, they can defend these positions. They have like huge prep. They're fine. At lower levels, because I used to play these lines, I've always found white has a lot of fun. Black has to navigate these like weird pawn structures. But let's go through black's options here. They can play something passive like knight d7, bishop e7. Then we just get kind of a nice version of the queen's gambit decline. Of course, there's this Cambridge Springs line, but that's its own thing. It's never been like super annoying for white to deal with. The critical lines are either like d takes c4, the Botvinnik system, or h6. These are the only lines that would, let's say, dissuade white from playing this position. Especially like these two in particular. Like we get the Botvinnik where black has to take on just an insane amount of risk. Sorry. Takes e4, b5, e5, h6, here, g5, take, like knight d7. Like you got to play this position as black, which maybe you really like it. If you're a madman and you like crazy positions and you see yourself as like a Shirov type, you know, like you really like wild, messy positions, then you'll love this. But a lot of players, they get into these types of positions, and I mean, like, they're just not ready. They're just like so sharp, and white has this like crazy initiative. It's very, very risky for black. And the other line, the Moscow, is also risky. Like h6, you can take on f6. That's more of a safer line. Let's say bishop h4, take e4. And then if black wants to survive here, they have to hold on to this pawn. Otherwise, they just have nothing after bishop takes c4. So they got to go g5 here. And then they got to go b5. And then white gets a lot of compensation for this pawn. And this is like, you know, really, really sharp position. I think white gets a really nice initiative here. I don't think you actually have to know a bunch of theory as white. But I think these positions are just more dangerous for black. Like, as white, you can make natural moves and you can find the initiative, right? Like bishop e2, queen c2, rook d1. You'll always find some play in the position. Whereas black, you make one wrong move or one mistake, like your position might collapse. Your king, like where's your king gonna go? Where does black's king go in this position, right? It's like very, very difficult. So I think from a practical point of view, just in my opinion, these positions were always easier for white to play. That doesn't mean like I always won every game, of course not, but I always like these positions from white's point of view. So if you're someone that feels comfortable with like attacking and playing for the initiative, then this kind of stuff is totally playable. And I found that quite a number of players against bishop g5, they don't go for like these critical lines. They just play bishop e7 here. You know, they're just like, okay, you got me. You play bishop g5. That's the critical move. I will not be testing you in the main lines. I will just play bishop e7 and accept a slightly worse queen's gambit declined where I already committed to c6, and like that's not so great. So you'll get a lot of players playing bishop e7. You'll get knight d7 as well. I mean, this line is serious also, but I think it's like pretty fun for white for a d4 player. I think we usually don't mind this one. So that's one, bishop g5. Let's call this one critical and difficult. And then the other big line is e3 going into like the Moran. So yeah, these lines have a bunch of theory, but in general they're like not as sharp, although they do get pretty sharp at the top levels. So what can we kind of break down here? Let's say black usually goes knight d7. And here white has a couple moves. Let's say bishop d3 has always been the classic move, and this position, d takes c4. This is known as the Moran variation, which has been hotly contested for many years. Lots of world championships. Kramnik Anand featured this one, and yeah, some really sharp stuff here. Over time, it feels like the practical choice has always been queen c2 in this position, and then waiting for one more move, just developing the queen, and then eventually developing the bishop to one of these squares, and just getting ready to castle and yeah, not go into the super sharp Moran lines with bishop d3. Then after bishop d6, okay, there's this fun line with g4 that's known as like the Shirov-Shabalov attack. That is again very sharp. I think this is like a very interesting surprise weapon that you can try to prepare if you don't think your opponent is going to be like up to date on the theory. You can definitely hit them with g4, you know, takes, rook g1, and these lines can be very fun to play. Bishop d2, e4, castle queenside, and you play for the initiative. Or you can play this in a much more solid way with like bishop d3 or bishop e2. And then we get these positions where black will take on c4, play b5. Let's say bishop goes back to e2. You can also put it on d3. Bishop b7, castles. And we get something like this. And actually, wait, I think white's bishop usually should go to d3. Let's put it there. Bishop e7, castles. I mean, these positions have a ton of theory. I think they're very playable. There's lots of ways for black to go wrong. There's lots of different ways for white to like pose little problems for black. You have different moves like knight g5. You can play a3 here. You can play e4, bishop d2. All these moves have their like unique ideas that I think are pretty fun and worth looking into. So if you don't want something like as sharp as bishop g5, but you want something kind of mainline and critical, then I would look into these positions, as you can definitely find room to outplay your opponents here, because no one's going to know the theory as well as like Anish Giri or someone like that. So your opponents, they're just going to play natural moves. They're going to play like a6, rook c8, a6, rook c8, c5, queen e7, this kind of thing. And yeah, it's up to white to try to use the space advantage and try to get something in before black is able to push c5. That's kind of the main idea in this position for black, is like they're just trying to get the c5 break in. And if they can do it successfully, they'll equalize. If not, then a lot of times they end up worse with the bishop on b7. Can you teach me how to outplay my opponents? Yeah, but it's just going to take some time. Yeah, but just keep watching and try to pick up some stuff. What's the purpose of queen c2? Essentially, it's kind of a waiting move, because you're just developing the queen. And then after bishop d3 here, takes, we have kind of slightly better control over this e4 square. I'm not sure what the concrete difference is between this and the normal Moran lines, but basically this one isn't quite as hectic usually, so it kind of gained in popularity. Another way you can play this position is you can play b3, and this would be one if you're looking to just get kind of like a fun structure, or a structure that you enjoy. For instance, I've always liked this position. Let's say b6, here, bishop d3, castles. I've always found this position to be very pleasant for white. And I have a number of games here where, I mean, the idea is just like rook d1 at some point, you play for e4, and you try to get a little bit of a space advantage, and then you can use that. And the idea behind b3, yeah, that if it kind of stops black from taking on c4, because now it doesn't really make sense. We just take back with the pawn, and we still have a bunch of space in the center. So it doesn't really help black to trade their d pawn for our b pawn. The drawback to b3, as many semi-Slav players know, is that it allows black to play e5. either in this position or the next one. But when black does play e5, the type of position we get is we get this kind of isolated queen pawn position, and these can be very, very playable. You get to play against the IQP, you go bishop b2 here, castles and so on. You'll have to check the theory, like I'm not sure what's exactly the most accurate way for white to play here. Maybe bishop b5 check is better. Maybe black doesn't play e5 here, maybe they castle first and then go e5. This also seems very, very possible. But usually we end up in a position like this where we take. Knight b5 might be a move as well. You can check the theory here. Something like bishop b2. And then you play against the IQP. And if this is comfortable for you, then this is a very, very legitimate way of playing the position. Because like you play against the isolated queen pawn, your opponent now has to handle this pawn. It could one day just become a weakness. Personally, I feel quite comfortable in these kinds of positions because I like playing against this IQP. But yeah, it might not be for everyone, but that's definitely another very serious option for white. Kind of not playing for a huge advantage, but playing for more of like a structure that you're comfortable in. All right, Ian. Well, hopefully that helps. You have all the options against the Slav. You have like two major options against the Semi-Slav with the bishop g5 and e3. And yeah, hopefully one of those works for you. It's not easy. Semi-Slav has always been, I think, one of the most solid openings out there. Because black gets like a very solid position, and then they get like clear ideas of counterplay. And so yeah, it's always a tough fight. I would say the Semi-Slav, it's like the Grunfeld of the d4, d5 openings. Always like a very, very tough theoretical fight.